Hi everyone, I'm Dr.Animaction. Welcome to the first video in my series of retrospectives on the most influential animation studios of all time. As many of you probably already know, I tend to dive into these sorts of videos head first, regardless of how extensive or content heavy they are, so in keeping with that tradition, I've chosen to start this series with a studio that fits that mold, Hanna-Barbera Productions. These videos will be a mix of history, anecdotes, and content. Particularly content, as the other stuff is interesting, but the cartoons are what I'm really here for. But that may even change as I write this first script. If it does, it can surprise us all, but I'm too lazy to come back here and rewrite this intro, so we'll all know what happened. This was the alternate video voted for on Patreon for this week, maybe a couple days late, so a new poll will go up today or tomorrow for whoever wants to vote. Make sure to like and subscribe if you love animation and want to help the channel continue to expand. And now, let's see what we can find as we dig into the long, interesting history of Hanna-Barbera. I guess the best place to start this video would be at the beginning. For Hanna-Barbera Productions, that came on July 7th, 1957, in good old Hollywood, California. Actually, I guess the company's story starts well before that even, going back to some point in the 30s, with a couple of guys named William Denby Hanna and Joseph Roland Barbera. William Hanna had been working at a California engineering firm, and Joseph Barbera at an accounting firm in New York City, before fate brought the pair together after each chose to make a career change that brought them to Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer's animation department. In 1937, the duo found themselves working on episodes of Tom and Jerry, where Hanna served as an animation supervisor and Barbera as a story and pre-production developer. The two men worked for MGM over the following 2 decades, with their work during the time receiving 7 Academy Awards and being nominated for another 12. And in 1955, Hanna and Barbera became co-head producers of MGM Animation Studios following the departure of the founder, Fred Quimby. They wouldn't last long in that position, though, as MGM decided to leave the animation business in 1957, and on May 15th of that year, permanently closed the doors on that department, forcing our intrepid heroes to find other opportunities. They tried to keep the doors open at MGM with pitches for new material, but the studio refused to bite. Instead, with the help of director George Sidney, a distribution deal with Screen Gems, and a capital investment from Columbia Pictures and its president Harry Cohn in exchange for an ownership percentage, HB Enterprises was born. With a board of directors primarily comprised of Sidney and executives from Screen Gems, and a production staff consisting primarily of former MGM employees, the new studio got down to business. Not content to ease into being their own production house, Hanna and Barbera released their first animated TV series that same year, with the Rough and Ready show premiering on December 14, 1957, just 6 short months after they left MGM. During his time with his previous employer, William Hanna had devised a technique for reducing the cost of producing the animated shorts like the ones he and Barbera had been working on by 50%. But the proposal never received any reply from the MGM executives, even though it would have changed the budget for each short from the $35,000 each they were currently receiving from the studio to just $17,500. Instead, Hanna continued to work on the method, and when it was time to make the first pitch to Screen Gems, had gotten the cost per short down to less than 20% of the original $35,000 price tag. He and Barbera were able to bring their first series to the board with just a $3,000 per episode budget requirement. However, concerned about the relatively new and unproven world of television, they eventually received $2,700 for each. Budget in place, they got to work using Hanna's new limited animation technique, which focused on key poses and positioning to impart a sense of movement for characters, and employed a more narrow, intimate, and close-up style rather than broad shots and full-panel views. This resulted in a need for fewer drawings and less inking. Also, as the pair had envisioned the future of television and the sweeping adoption of color, all of their series were produced in full color from the very beginning, and this technique necessitated less painting as well. Combined with simpler, less detailed backgrounds, this allowed the studio to work not only cheaper, but faster, and create an experience that Hanna felt fit more appropriately on the small screens of home television, and which he described as intimacy over spectacle. Rough and Ready employed the idea of a character duo that Hanna and Barbera had used to great success in Tom and Jerry, but flipped the script to make them best friends instead of rivals, which also helped reduce the heavy lifting for the animators by allowing more of a focus on comedy and dialogue rather than action. With a voice cast of MGM alumni and soundtrack from the studio's new in-house composer and music director Hoyt Curtin, who had been well known for his work on commercials at the time and whom Hanna and Barbera had worked with briefly while at MGM, Rough and Ready became the series that introduced the company to the world. Though the pair were concerned about how their new material would be received in this new format, the series ran on NBC for 156 episodes over 3 seasons on the air. The remaining years of the decade would see several more works from the studio across multiple lines of business. On TV, which was a mostly unknown and unproven commodity at the time, some of Hanna-Barbera's most enduring characters would make their first appearances, starting with those found on the Huckleberry Hound show. This new series launched in syndication on September 29, 1958, where it aired in time slots just before primetime in most of the country. The show was an anthology consisting of several segments, with the first featuring the new title character, Huckleberry Hound. The others of the 3 segments contained in each episode featured other new characters as well, like Pixie and Dixie, a pair of mice affectionately referred to as the Mises, and their feline nemesis, Mr. Jinx, and the character who would go on to eventually be the company's flagship, Yogi Bear. The segments in this show used music from composer Curtin and were voiced by talent inherited from MGM, primarily their very own man of 1,000 voices, Daws Butler, and cohort Don Messick. Butler gave us the original iconic voices of Huckleberry, Yogi, Dixie, and Mr. Jinx, and Messick filled out the cast by voicing Boo Boo, Pixie, and Ranger Smith. The pair also shared narrating duties and voiced various other minor characters throughout the show's run, which consisted of 156 episodes over 3 seasons. The following year, in 1959, the studio reincorporated, changing its name officially from HB Enterprises to Hanna-Barbera Productions. Under this label, they released their last new cartoon of the decade, The Quick Draw McGraw Show, which again took on an anthology format. The main segment of Quick Draw was supplemented with others of characters like Augie Doggie and Augie Daddy and Snooper and Blabber. Much like Huckleberry Hound, the series soundtrack again came from Curtin, and Butler took on the lion's share of voice acting duties in this one as well, voicing both Quick Draw and his deputy Baba Louie, Augie Doggie, and the main Snooper and Blabber characters Super Snooper and Blabber Mouse. This series aired for 3 years in first-run syndication, receiving 45 episodes. Outside of the realm of television, Hanna-Barbera also continued work in the environment they'd come up in, releasing their own series of theatrical shorts in 1959 called Loopy de Loop. The shorts featured the character Loopy, a good-hearted and well-meaning wolf with a terrible grasp of the English language, voiced, unsurprisingly at this point, by the versatile Daws Butler and again soundtracked by Hoyt Curtin. This would be the only theatrical cartoon series the studio produced, but would receive 48 7-minute episodes between 1959 and 1965. Hanna-Barbera also kept the studio busy in another line of work they'd engaged in while at MGM, advertising. Oddly, this advertising between 1957 and 1959 consisted only of work for various brands of cereal. During this time, Rough and Ready were sponsored by Post Consumer Brands. The Huckleberry Hound characters served as mascots for Kellogg's, appearing across a variety of products like Corn Flakes, Sugar Stars, and Sugar Smacks, with the Quick Draw characters also showing up on Sugar Smacks and one of Kellogg's flagship brands, Rice Krispies. The studio's characters would continue to represent various brands over the next several decades as well, but we'll get to that. Also during this time, the studio would focus on increasing their capacity and capabilities, bringing on various industry talents. Among these were the company's new head writers of Michael Maltese and Warren Foster in 1958 and 59 respectively. The two had previously worked extensively on various Looney Tunes projects for the likes of Fritz Freeling and Chuck Jones before coming to Hanna-Barbera to work on their large number of new properties. HB also got the opportunity to bring in a whole bunch of Disney alums in 1959, as that company had laid off a large portion of its animation department following the theatrical disappointment of Sleeping Beauty. Among those that Hanna-Barbera was able to snatch up were editors Joe Ruby and Ken Spears, who we'll talk about much more in a future episode of the series, and character designer Iwo Takamoto. The latter was responsible for designing some of the studio's most lasting icons, including Scooby-Doo and Astro, but we'll get to them shortly too. The studio definitely had a huge number of home runs during this time period, but it also had a couple of duds too, so let's take a look at those real quick. First was an attempt at a live-action comedy series that never made it past the pilot episode. We'll Take Manhattan was intended to be a series about a rookie lawyer who takes on a 140-year-old Native American as a client trying to reclaim territory in Manhattan that used to belong to his tribe. Sounds like the type of socially and racially sensitive story that can't possibly go wrong, especially with a main character named Chief Irontail, played by a white guy from Quebec. It's probably for the best that that one never panned out. The pilot reportedly aired once on April 30th of 1967 on NBC. The other series that the studio struck out on, and I guess I'm going with baseball analogies in this section for some reason, was also from 1967. The pilot was called The World, Color It Happy, and apparently, according to the Hanna-Barbera wiki, was done as a response to Walt Disney's Wonderful World of Color. I say series because Wikipedia has it listed as an unsold pilot, But that may be wrong, as IMDb lists it as a TV movie. Based on some of the names associated with it on IMDb, it sounds like it would be more of a movie, but at the same time, there's a video on YouTube of the intro and outro for it that sure looks like it's for a TV show. Whatever it is, there's hardly any information on it out there, so pick your favorite option and run with it, I guess. I mentioned Hoyt Curtin earlier as Hanna-Barbera's first in-house composer, so let's talk about him a little more, as music was such an important part of these older cartoons. He was responsible for dozens of the studio's themes over a tenure with them that lasted from 1957 to 1986. Everything from the theme to their first show, Rough and Ready, all the way up to things like The Smurfs. Plus, he did some other work outside of the company that most of us probably know. Specifically, he did the music for Battle of the Planets. Not only that, but he did movie work for the infamous Ed Wood, and according to an interview he gave, his regular pianist, Jack Cookerly, invented the synthesizer for the theme Curtin wrote for Jonny Quest. Altogether, he has 135 composer credits and 64 soundtrack credits on IMDb, which is absolutely insane. But he wasn't the only musical mastermind to work for Hanna-Barbera, though. For a few years during Curtin's tenure, the role of musical director for the studio was filled by a different composer named Ted Nichols. Ted filled this role from 1963 to 1972, and during that time he worked pretty closely with Curtin, co-writing the aforementioned Jonny Quest theme, and then doing musical arrangements for several other shows across his career, including the Flintstones feature film, The Man Called Flintstone. He's got 30 composer credits on IMDb, even working on projects as recently as The Incredibles 2, which he did the score for. He's also written the music for 5 operas as well, so Hanna-Barbera were definitely never lacking in the music department. Toward the beginning of the video, I briefly mentioned a couple of voice actors that Hanna-Barbera used in a lot of these early productions, named Dawes Butler and Don Messick, but I wanted to take some time to talk about them, and the other major voices in the Hanna-Barbera stable. Okay, well, not actually talk about them, as that could easily be an entire video or series on its own, but at least give them the recognition they deserve for the work they did this decade. So here's a look at the most prolific voice actors in Hanna-Barbera Productions through the 50s and 60s. Hanna-Barbera started the new decade off with some significant events, including the move to a new studio space and the winning of animation's first ever Emmy Award, given to the Huckleberry Hound Show for outstanding achievement in the field of children's programming. The first year of the decade also marked the studio's first foray into true primetime programming with what would become one of their most impactful, longest-lasting shows, The Flintstones. This was Hanna-Barbera's first attempt at a full 30-minute animated series and was built as a combination of a Stone Age setting with the situational comedy of the popular mid-50s series The Honeymooners. The series released to generally mixed reviews, but managed to rank 18th in the ratings during its first season at the Friday at 8:30 p.m. time slot on ABC, and managed a nearly 25% rating share. It would go on to become the longest-running, most profitable animated series on a major network until it was dethroned by The Simpsons over 30 years later in 1997. That almost didn't happen, though, as Honeymooners star Jackie Gleason had seriously considered suing Hanna-Barbera for copyright infringement over the very obvious similarities between the Flintstones and his show. Fred and Barney were preemptively saved by their own popularity, though, as Gleason was eventually quoted as saying he couldn't bring himself to become, quote, the man who yanked Fred Flintstone off the air, end quote. The initial run of the series lasted until April of 1966 and racked up 166 episodes, but that first version won't be the last of the series we see. The success that the Flintstones found didn't mean that HB took the rest of the decade off, though. Instead, they managed to not only roll out a couple of more primetime series with 1961's Top Cat, 1962's The Jetsons, and 1964's Johnny Quest, but also to release at least 2 new series a year throughout the rest of the decade, except during 1963 when they only released 1. We'll hit their filmography for the era at the end of the video, though. In 1965, Hanna-Barbera ended the Screen Gems era when the studio was purchased by Taft Broadcasting, a company tied to the 27th President of the United States, William Howard Taft. Originally founded as a newspaper company in 1880 by President Taft's brother Charles Phelps Taft, that company expanded into broadcast radio in 1939, and eventually to television in 1957. They purchased Hanna-Barbera from Screen Gems under an offer made in 1965 that was finalized in 1966 after settlement of a lawsuit by the family of former shareholder Harry Cohn over the value of his stock. The sale of the studio closed for $12 million, and Taft became Hanna-Barbera's parent company and main distributor. However, Screen Gems retained the rights for licensing and distribution of all of the characters Hanna-Barbera had produced under them until the contracts granting those rights expired in 1974 and reverted back to Hanna-Barbera, with syndication rights remaining with Columbia Pictures even longer than that into 1983. That meant Hanna-Barbera had even more work to do so that they could build up a new catalog of properties under the new ownership. There were a couple of series released during the lawsuit period, including another of the company's most beloved properties, Space Ghost, that I wasn't able to find licensing and distribution history for. So I really can't say whether these 1966 releases benefited Screen Gems and Columbia or Taft. But in 1967, Hanna-Barbera cranked out an impressive 9 new properties to go with their new distributor. A number of these shows even crossed generations, seeing their episodes back on the air in the 80s, including the company's take on the Fantastic Four, the Herculoids, Birdman, Shazam, and the Mighty Mightor. A large number of these releases remain popular to this day, and many of them can be traced back to one man that the studio hired in 1965 named Alex Toth. Toth had previously worked for DC Comics from 1947 to 1952, penciling titles like Green Lantern, Strange Adventures, and the Dal Evans comic, before becoming art director on the 1962 animated sci-fi show Space Angel. Hanna-Barbera hired him as a production designer and storyboard artist, and in this capacity Toth created Space Ghost, Birdman, the Galaxy Trio, the Herculoids, and Dino Boy. 1968 also saw the release of a new series called Wacky Races, which introduced 2 more of the studio's most recognizable characters with Penelope Pitstop and Dick Dastardly, both of whom would get solo spin-offs the following year. And although the characters would appear in similar series later on, the Hanna-Barbera mainstays from the Screen Gems era did not compete in this first season of the races. The studio closed out their television animation efforts for the decade on another high note, though, with the release of Scooby-Doo, Where Are You? In 1969. The show was created by the previously mentioned Joe Ruby and Ken Spears from characters designed by the also previously mentioned Iwo Takamoto. As one of HB's longest-running characters, appearing nearly constantly in one form or another since its creation, it's probably not a show I need to do much recap on. One interesting bit about it was the appearance of voice-acting legend Frank Welker in his first major cartoon role as Fred Jones, for which he was pretty much able to use his normal voice, unlike almost every other role that came after. The show received 25 episodes on CBS between 1969 and 70, and served as the model Hanna-Barbera would build several other shows on throughout the next decade. The studio also started to dip their toes into live action during this period with the 1968 releases of The New Adventures of Huckleberry Finn and the Banana Splits Adventure Hour. Huck Finn was the first weekly television show ever developed that combined both live actors and animation by shooting the live action in front of a blue screen and laying in the animation later. According to Barbera, it was also the most expensive half-hour program ever aired, but I wasn't able to find any budget numbers to verify that. Not that the studio couldn't afford it at the same time, as the July 24, 1967 issue of the Toledo Blade newspaper states that since HB entered the Saturday morning market, advertising costs to sponsors had increased from $1,000 per minute to $9,200 per minute. Whatever the actual case may be, the show lasted for 20 episodes on NBC. Their other foray into live action in 1968 came in the form of the Banana Splits Adventure Hour. This one took the form of a variety show hosted by the 4 members of the anthropomorphic rock group, the Banana Splits. These characters would perform skits and songs as wraparounds for the other content in the series, which consisted of 3 animated segments, The Arabian Nights, The Three Musketeers, and Micro Adventures, as well as one live-action segment called Danger Island, which starred future Airwolf pilot Jan Michael Vincent. The Splits ran for a total of 36 episodes and several side projects, including educational shorts, a TV movie, and even their own 8-issue comic series from Gold Key. One of the most interesting bits of trivia about the Banana Splits is that the members of the band were designed by Sid and Marty Krofft before the brothers launched their own production company the following year. Working on the Banana Splits led to a friendly relationship with Hanna-Barbera for the Kroffts, who credit the Banana Splits for being a gateway for them getting their own H.R. Pufnstuf series picked up. And that show eventually premiered as part of an hour-long Banana Splits special. The second nugget that you all should hear is that all of the live-action segments of both the Banana Splits and Danger Island were directed by Richard Donner. You know, the guy who directed Superman and The Omen. Hanna-Barbera didn't just spend the 60s on TV, though, as they had several other pokers in the fire during the decade as well. One of these was animated films, which the studio released 2 of this decade, in addition to the aforementioned Loopy-de-Loop shorts. The studio's first full-length animated feature came in June of 1964 with Hey There, It's Yogi Bear. This was also the first animated feature film based on a TV show and retained all of the series' voice cast. The film was fairly well received and made nearly $2.5 million worldwide on an undisclosed budget. The studio released another animated film just a couple of years later with 1966's The Man Called Flintstone, which was produced as a sort of series finale when the Flintstones TV series ended that same year. Unlike the show, which was a sitcom, the movie was a musical comedy that parodied spy films of the era. I found references to this one being a minor success at the box office, but I wasn't able to track down any hard numbers on either the budget or the take, so that's all the detail I can give there. Oddly, the movie ends with Fred and Barney probably having killed 4 people as they trap the cast of villains inside an intercontinental missile and shoot them into space. The studio also kept their fingers in various other business ventures throughout the decade as well. These not only included producing commercials for various companies, but also educational projects, industrial videos, and even a couple of animated sequences for other properties. For commercials, Hanna-Barbera expanded their footprint well beyond the world of cereal, with the characters moving on to advertising for everything from shoes to cars. They made commercials for Lion Oil, the Rexall chain of pharmacies, Welch's Jelly, Dodge, and PF Flyers brand shoes. Yogi Bear also appeared as a spokesman for both the American Heart Association and the American Cancer Society, where he was joined by the Flintstones. That was especially ironic since the studio also produced commercials for not only Philip Morris USA, producer of Marlboro cigarettes, but Winston cigarettes as well, where the Flintstone characters served as the spokespeople. Oh, and the Flintstones sold Busch beer too. Moving on from advertising and the Flintstones' checkered past, though, we can take a look at the animated educational videos that the studio produced in 1969. There were apparently 3 that they did for publishers Harper & Row, and 6 for publisher McGraw-Hill. The McGraw videos focused on topics in science, while the others for Harper & Row covered various topics such as English and a couple of others I can't guess at based on the titles. I looked all over for these to give some a watch, but I just couldn't find them anywhere. In fact, there's so absolutely little information on them that I can't say empirically whether they exist at all. They're listed on Wikipedia though, so believe what you want, I guess. Either way, they popped up on a list and I wanted to make sure that I at least mentioned them here. I at least know that some of the list are real, as I did find some production cells from a later 1974 version of the material, for what that's worth, and I do plan to continue the hunt, so let me know in the comments if you've got any insight into these things. Moving on though, Hanna-Barbera also produced quite a few industrial films for various companies this decade, mostly between 1964 and 1966. As these were primarily produced for specific organizations, they're also pretty hard to find, but at least a few of them are still out there. Don't get me wrong, there aren't a lot of them out there, but enough to make me not completely question their existence. I was able to find 1964's live-action The Story of Dr. Lister here on YouTube, and the 1967 animated Chamber of Commerce film The Incredible Voyage of Marco Gulliver on the Hagley Digital Archive site. So it looks like these were potentially all mixed medium with some live and some not. Again, sorry to be short on details, but I can only find what there is to find. And finally on the list I put together for this time period, there were a couple last bits of animation the studio did in support of other projects. The first of these projects was the popular 1964 sitcom Bewitched, for which Hanna-Barbera did the animated opening credits. I watched this show all the time on Nick at Night when I was a kid and had no idea that the intro came from them. Anyway, the other work of the era they contributed to was the film Project X from 1968. This movie included several animated sequences that were all provided by Hanna-Barbera. At least those two were easier to track down. Like I said though, let me know if you have any insights on those educational or industrial productions, as I'm pretty curious. So because this video would never end if I covered every series in depth, here's a rundown of all their properties and the shows that they consisted of to hit airwaves between 1960 and 1969, along with any at-a-glance information I could put together. I'm sure this isn't the last time I'll look at any of these, so I'm pretty confident we'll talk about them more in the future. There you go. A bit of history, a bit of trivia, and a bit of discussion about all of the content Hanna-Barbera put out between the time they opened their doors in 1957 and the end of the 1960s. Let me know what you thought of the video and the content. I'm interested in your opinions on whether you thought it was a good look at the studio or if it should have been more thorough. They've got a ton of content and a ton of history to cover, so I ended up breaking it up somewhat, but I'll keep going with a look at how the 70s went for them when I do the next video in the series. Don't forget to like and subscribe if you haven't already, and keep watching for the next video in the animated 90s series. Thanks for watching, stay tuned, and stay tuned, as in cartoons. Later.